Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming out this evening. I am just so honoured to be here this evening with one of my heroes and indeed one of the most inspirational women in Australian history, Anne Summers. Can I thank Linda for that wonderful introduction? I turned to Anne when Linda said living legends, and I thought, no pressure there. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So, Anne, I think we might just get straight into this because I've got a lot of questions that I want to ask you. Having read parts of your book and looking at your life history, which has just been an amazing history, and one that I was not aware had actually quite an influence on me as a young woman first discovering feminism in my teenage years. But I did want to start off with your new book, Unfettered and Alive, which is your second, well, it's a memoir. You describe this one as a memoir. And you start this book, Anne, with a letter to yourself, which I found really interesting because just the other day I was also asked to write a letter to my 20-year-old self. So perhaps I could start off today. You've written to yourself at 30. I was asked to write to myself at 20. But perhaps I could ask you today to tell us a little bit about the contents of that letter. Because for me, when I thought, okay, what do I write? What do I write to my 20-year-old self? Which parts of my life do I expose? Which parts of my life do I focus on and emphasise to myself at 20 years old? Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this letter to your 30-year-old self and the process that you went through?
Okay. Just before I answer that question, can I just say how delighted I am to be in Perth? And I was very disappointed at the end of last year when I was back in Australia. I'm living in New York at the moment, so back in Australia doing a supposedly national tour to talk about my book, which was newly published. And I was very disappointed that I was unable to come to Perth then, but we were unable to find a sponsor who would put on an event like this. So when Phil from the Australian Fabians said, well, if you want to come back, we'll do something, and it turned out I was coming back now, and I contacted him and said, well, is the office still open? And I'm just so glad and grateful to the Australian Fabians that it was, and so glad to be here and to see this fabulous crowd tonight. So thank you very much for having me. But to answer the question, I guess one of the reasons I wrote that letter to myself was to try to kind of give the book that follows it a bit of a context, because the book starts in 1975 when I was 30, and my previous book, Ducks on the Pond, which is my previous volume, which I called an autobiography, I call this one a memoir. I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but partly what your publisher tells you, I think. I sort of wanted to provide a justification for why I was starting the book at 30, so just to kind of give a bit of a quick history about the first 30 years, and also to try to set out what my sort of self-imposed task with this book was, and what it really was to try to explain to myself and to anyone who might read the book how it was that I came from being this very kind of self-loathing, lacking in confidence, fat, ugly schoolgirl in Adelaide in the 1950s who thought I could do nothing to do all the things that I've done. And so the letter tries to set that context. And one of the things that I sort of remind myself about is that when I was young, a young girl, I knew that I wasn't satisfied with what was around me. I knew that I wanted something different, but I wasn't quite sure what it was or where to find it. I looked at the women in my family, and my mother had 6 children and was known in those days by that very strange term, housewife. and her sister, Auntie Gwen, was a nun, and her other sister, Auntie Nance, was on the shelf. Which I can see there's a lot of recognition of that term in this room. I did actually speak to some people the other day who'd never heard of it, that they were very young. But you know, on the shelf, of course, meant that you were 30 and not married. And in fact, the Auntie Nance to me was the most interesting of the women in my family, because she had money, even though she had quite a lowly job. She worked in a bank, and it was in the days when women weren't allowed to handle money, so she wasn't even a teller. You know, she was just probably making cups of tea and filing the deposit slips or whatever they did. But she had money, she was independent, and she took me out to dinner once in Melbourne. I was 17, she took me to Florentino restaurant, and that was the most sophisticated thing I had ever done in my life. And I couldn't believe that, you could go there and have Italian food and drink a glass of wine and imagine you're in Rome. It was wonderful. So the whole task that I set myself for this book was to try to tell it, because people always say to me, well, how did you do it? And I said, well, I don't know, I just do it. I just do, follow my footsteps and do what I want to do and just do it. And sometimes I succeed and sometimes I fail, but I just keep going. But this kind of forced me to try to explain a little bit of how.
I wanted to pick up on something that you said there, Anne, when you described yourself as a young girl and moving away from that self-image and that self-loathing that you had. And I want to read a quote of yours from an article, an interview that you did, I think it was in the Sydney Morning Herald, where you say this. You say, I was born into a world that expected very little of women like me. We were meant to tread lightly on the earth, influence the events through our husbands and children, if at all. We were meant to fade into invisibility as we aged. I defied all of those expectations, and so have millions of women like me. Those words really ring true for my own story, and in fact, in my own book, I describe it as Arab women, we're not meant for the sun. We're told that if you reach for the sun, you'll wither. And you're so weak that the only thing that we can do is shroud ourselves in black and fade into the greyness. And hearing Linda's introduction this afternoon or evening, where she also said there was an expectation on her from her parents that living your life through a partner, and this idea that your worth is measured by the kind of husband and the kind of partner you can attract and what kind of wife you are. So we have three women from three very different backgrounds who have had three very different life trajectories, and dare I say perhaps even three different generations, all have an affinity with what you say here. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and why do you think that is? Why do you think that this is it's something that cuts across cultures and generations and backgrounds? Why is that?
I mean, it's one of the things I think that in the women's movement, when women's liberation kind of came to Australia in 1969, and I was very up for it and got involved from day one. So in all that's 50 years ago now. One of the things that we had to kind of confront were the expectations that were placed on us by society, often mediated by our parents. My mother's ambition was to find a really nice doctor or lawyer for a husband. Never any suggestion I might be a doctor or a lawyer. I mean, the most I could be was a teacher or a nurse. Nothing wrong with either of those, but the idea was that you gain your status and your income, and everything would be conferred on, and your name conferred on you by your husband. And in fact, when I first got married, Summers is my married name. When I was first married to a man by the name of John Summers, and my first letter, those days people used to write letters, and my mother wrote me a letter because I was living away from Adelaide, and it was addressed to Mrs. John Summers, and I sent it back to her. Who's that? Didn't you call me Anne? So, you know, it's so hard to explain today, although it's interesting that Linda has the same experience and so did you, that this maybe more traditional societies are still, you know, having that view and you know, older generations like me have managed to fight it off. But it is a very, very strong notion ingrained in us that we get our identities, our names, our status, our very kind of being is conferred on us by a husband. You know, this is the law of patriarchy, and this is what we have been struggling against, and saying, well, you know, you might want to be married, you might want to have children, you might take your husband's name. That's the fashion again these days. Though I wouldn't advocate it, I wouldn't do it for myself now, but I did it then because I couldn't stand my family. I wanted to get away from their names. So I used to joke that I only married John for his name, which is not true. I didn't, but it was a much nicer name than my maiden name, so I decided to keep it when we broke up. But this is the core issue, about women establishing themselves, their own identity, their own ambitions, and their own right to carve a place for themselves. And the other thing that we had to do, one of the books that most influenced me back then and still now, is Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex. And it was written in 1949, it's a French book, but I read a translation of it in the late 60s, and it turns out it was a very bad translation. It's now, since just a few years ago, it's been retranslated by feminists rather than, as I explain in this book. I learned to my horror that the translation that I read was translated by a man who was a biologist, because the Knopf publishers in New York had heard about the success of this book, The Second Sex, thought it was a biology book. And they didn't know it was a feminist book. Yeah. So anyway, the new book is about 3 times as long, because Knopf thought the original was too long, so he just chopped it to pieces. And also the key quote of the book, which has sort of basically changed my life, opens the edition that I read, you know, when I was 20, and it's now in the new feminist translation. It's on about page 655. But wherever it is, the quote is, "One is not born, rather one becomes a woman." And so the whole idea that what a woman is socially constructed. You know, it is not an innate thing. It is something that and so different societies confer different identities, different possibilities. I mean, there are a lot of societies where women are not regarded the way our societies have regarded us, where women are in charge, women have financial power, women, you know, are decision makers. But in the societies that we find ourselves in, that has not been the case. And so that has been the thing that we have been struggling with for the last 50 years, in my case, and younger women today are still finding that it's necessary to do that, and that is to say, okay, we want to decide who we are, and we will get our identity and our status from what we do, and not from some man that we happen to be married to, or born, you know, who happens to be our father.
So Anne, you were born into this world that expected very little of you. You know, there was all of these expectations, I guess, in much the same way that I can relate to. For me, it was about at the age of 14 when I discovered a book, My Mother, Myself, and read the passages in there about women, how women construct for other women the expectations. And that started my journey into feminism, and I read Simone de Beauvoir, and I used to read these books in my bedroom and hide them under my mattress so that none of my family would know that I was reading books on feminism. Can you pinpoint a moment or a time in your life that really, that kind of changed everything for you? Can you pinpoint a moment where you came to feminism, or was it more a gradual process for you?
Well, both. I mean, there was one particular thing I read that just where like the sparks just like, you know, went off, and that would have been in about 1966, 67, I think it was. I just got married, and I was actually living in a remote Aboriginal community in northern South Australia, because my husband had a job there, and I used to subscribe to a publication called New Left Review, which was a Marxist publication, and I used to get it sent up there. So it was up there in the middle of the desert, and I read this article, and just the context was, you know, I had taken my husband's name and I got married, but I did not think there was anything in the way of a young, sophisticated, modern woman like myself, because I thought I'd left all that behind me. I'd been to university, you know, there didn't seem to be any impediments to what we could do. It didn't occur to me there was anything wrong. I read this book it was an article, a very long article in New Left Review by a British woman called Juliet Mitchell, and it was called Woman, the Longest Revolution, and subsequently published as a book. And that opened my eyes because she said, you know, and it was from like a Marxist perspective, and I was a bit of a Marxist back then. We didn't use the word feminism then, we were women's liberationists. We thought feminism was bourgeois and old-fashioned fuddy-duddy, weren't interested in that. We were young, modern liberationists. This article argued that women today were still oppressed within the family. She identified sort of the four, what she called, you know, it was a very kind of Marxian analysis, but the four structures of women's oppression, and one of them was, I can't remember them all now, but the family, education, employment, and so on. And I was just so stunned with recognition that the world that she described actually matched my own life, and that she analysed the fact that despite the fact that I thought I was a modern, young, emancipated woman, in fact, there were these barriers. You know, there was no equal pay, there was no equal employment opportunities, there was, when it came to sexuality and reproduction, there were all these issues. And I thought, yes, this is true, this is actually true, and that's what got me started. And then, of course, a couple of years later, when women's liberation really exploded, and our main sources of ideas for the first year anyway were pamphlets from the American women, and they particularly were mostly women who came out of the left and women who had been in the anti-Vietnam movement, as I had, and they described experiences with which resonated totally, that even though we were all, you know, part of the revolutionary left and we were there to liberate the world and free the people of North Vietnam and Cuba and, you know, Bolivia and everywhere, we were still doing the shit work, we were doing all the domestic work, we were, you know, the waitresses of the banquet of life, as Bette Midler used to say. And we thought there was liberation for everybody, but not for us. And those stories really resonated about the kind of basic sexual oppression of women on the left, the fact that the women on the left were expected to do all the work and get none of the credit. You know, all the heroes of the New Left were men. You know, women never made speeches, women never asked questions at meetings. We were meant to just be there, looking good and basically invisible. And so that resonated too. And so women's liberation was really a response to that. So women wanted to have the same political involvement as well as having their own identity in their own lives.
So it sounds to me like for you it was about, you know, the personal, and then there was this realisation that there's an institutional kind of a framework, patriarchy behind it. So, and I find that particularly interesting. What I also find particularly interesting that you said, Anne, was you differentiated between women's liberation and feminism. And you said that you considered back then feminism to be bourgeois and so forth. How do you see it now? Do you see that there is a difference between women's liberation and feminism? Is one term obsolete, or you know, how do you reconcile that now?
Well, I suppose you know, young feminists today would look back on we women's liberationists in the same way that we women's liberationists look back on the feminists of our day. You know, much older, boring. You know, very. You know, we thought that the older feminists, so these are women who'd been active, say, in the 1920s and 30s, were very puritanical. You know, they were against sex, they were against drinking. You know, whereas we were, you know, women of the 60s. I'll leave it at that. But when we eventually started using the term feminism, which was only after a few years, one thing is that, you know, the media shortened it to women's libbers, so we were libbers, so it became women's lib, which was a bit glib. So, you know, in the end we thought feminism probably was better, but it still wasn't enough. So there were a lot, you know, you had to be, what sort of feminist were you? Were you a radical feminist or a socialist feminist or a lesbian feminist or a separatist feminist, or, you know, there was all kinds of feminists. Now we're all just feminists. And that probably, you know, now everyone says, well, are you a feminist or aren't you a feminist, and all of that. And we spend an awful lot of time, I think, arguing rather futilely about that. Whereas I think what's the whole stuff about Julie Bishop, and is she or isn't she, and who gives a rat's.
But she has nice shoes.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to say anything because I don't trust myself. All I would say is that I think the feminism today is perhaps so broad a term that maybe it needs to be defined a bit more. I mean, you know, a term that covers everyone, sort of from Beyonce to all of us. Maybe it needs a little definition.
Do you think there's an issue with that? Do you think that you know, not only does it need a definition, but does it need more than that? I mean, considering this whole idea of, do you identify as a feminist or not, and you hear women who are enjoying the fruits of your work and the work of our sisters and women's libbers as they were, who say, well, feminism, I'm not a feminist. Do you think there needs to be some kind of regeneration of feminism for this generation?
Well, you know, what I think is more important, rather than say, are you a feminist, I'd say, do you support abortion? You know, let's get cut to the chase and deal with the issues, and, you know, feminist issues. I mean, what matters, feminism matters because it's meant to be delivering opportunities and equality for women. And the question about, you know, is the difference between feminism and women's liberation, I do think feminism has, and I have too, become much more pragmatic than I mean, I used to be a very utopian sort of feminist, and you know, nothing short of the revolution would be satisfactory. And I changed my approach to the disgust of a lot of people. But you know, when I went into politics, I'm not politics in the way that you are, I'm a member of Parliament, but I went to work in the bureaucracy, and then I went to work for Paul Keating, and it seemed to me that these were really important opportunities to use the power of government to achieve some of the reforms that we'd always talked about and argued for, and particularly things like, you know, the biggest thing that was done by the Hawke government, by Senator Susan Ryan, who was the Minister for Women back then, was the Sex Discrimination Act. I mean, I didn't even know when I was growing up that, you know, that it was, again, there were laws stopping me from doing things, stopping me from having certain jobs, stopping me from getting equal pay, stopping me from, you know, all kinds of things. It was actually legal to do that. And it was a tremendous shock once you realised that. And so the importance of having that legislation which got rid of all of that, at least in theory, was absolutely changed everything. And so I realised the power of government, and to be able to work in the Prime Minister's department or in the Prime Minister's office and actually do something major and concrete around childcare, or around violence against women, or to set up, you know, when I worked for Keating, we set up national breast screening, which is just a tiny little thing back then. Now, look at it, you know, it's everywhere, and every woman in Australia, hopefully, has access to it. We set up cervical cancer screening. So you can do all these really practical things, and I decided that the trade-off was worth it, to achieve those practical things rather than waiting for the revolution.
I want to just probe a little bit with you on something that's quite, I guess, a bit personal to me, because for a long time I actually did reject feminism, because as a woman of colour, I felt that feminism didn't speak or didn't include women like me, that it didn't speak to the issues that I was facing. When I first discovered feminism, it was in this kind of awe that, oh my God, white women go through this shit too. But But then as I got further and further into feminism, I kind of found that it didn't really have a space for me. And in fact, feminism wanted to save me, but not include me, if that makes any sense. And I'd like to get your opinion on that, on whether you think feminism now has become a more inclusive, more, I guess, woke feminism to intersectionalities like race and disability.
Well, I think one of the sort of quite sad things is that when we first got going in the early 70s, I think we were much more diverse and inclusionary than we became. And certainly in the early days in Sydney, there were Aboriginal women, there were women from a lot of different cultures, and there were certainly disabled women involved, very actively involved at all levels of women's liberation. And I'm not sure what happened. I'm not sure how.
The 90s happened.
I guess the 90s. Well, I think DIY feminism was very destructive. That was the 90s, where everyone was just, girl power and everyone just go off and do their own thing. And the movement kind of, collapsed. So I guess we're trying to, and the way you rebuild a movement is very different now in the age of social media and the kind of technology. I mean, when we started off doing the kind of politics that I did when I was a young radical, I mean, I didn't even have a telephone, a landline, let alone what we have now. So, I mean, I think we're actual geniuses the way we managed to communicate. If you wanted to organise something, you used to write people letters or go around to their house. But now, of course, the capacity to organise and to communicate and to reach a huge audience, almost instantaneously, has kind of changed everything. And at the same time as we've become able to reach anybody, we've also become more closed in and talking to people we know and people we like. But just on the intersectionality thing, I can just share a story with you, which is maybe not about me, but I have been doing a bit of work in the States on a woman called Kimberly Crenshaw, who you may know. She's the woman who invented the term intersectionality, and the reason I'm interested in her is that I'm going to be involved in some events with her in the festival that my partner organises in New York in May. And so I've been doing a lot of work on her, and she is phenomenally interesting, and she gave a TED talk, which I would really recommend you have a look. You can easily find it on YouTube, Kimberly Crenshaw. And she's a professor of law at University of Columbia, and she does this talk where she gets the whole audience to stand up, and she says, I'm going to say some names to you, and it's got some notes here, and she says, if you know the name if you recognise the name that I say, remain standing, and if you don't recognise it, please sit down. And so she starts saying these names. She says, Eric Garner, everybody still remains standing. She says, Trayvon Martin, everybody remains standing. She says, Freddie Gray, everybody remains standing. She says, Michael Brown, everyone remains standing. Then she says, Tanisha Anderson, half the audience sit down. And then she says, Natasha McCanna, more people sit down. Michelle Cusseau, Maya Hall. And she says, by the time she's finished going through these women's names, the only people left standing are the people who work for her. And the names that the boys' names that I read, probably most of you would recognise, are boys who've been shot and killed by the police in America, black boys, African American boys for the most part. The names of the women, these are African American women who've been shot by the police. There have been 70 of these women identified, ranging in age from 7 to 90, and nobody knows anything about them. And the whole point about the intersectionality that Kimberly Crenshaw argues for is that there's got to be a way of naming and understanding. Our thinking has to expand so when we talk about police violence against black people, it can't just be violence against black men, it's also got to be violence against black women. And so she's come up with this hashtag, say her name. And so the whole thing about this TED talk she gives is about say her name, learn these women's names, honour them in the same way that the boys are honoured. And I think it's a very powerful speech, a very powerful concept, and she's become very involved in the Me Too movement too, as has Tarana Burke, who first invented Me Too, not as a hashtag, but as an actual movement, to say, well, when we talk about sexual violence, or we talk about sexual harassment, and we talk about, you know, what happened with Harvey Weinstein and all of that, don't forget the black women, or the women of colour, who have also been victims of sexual harassment, but maybe their attackers weren't Hollywood movie stars. Maybe it's a different situation. So as a result of all this, you know, what's happening now is there's been a very powerful documentary made in the States about a guy called, what's his name, Steve Kelly? R. Kelly?
Oh, the singer.
The singer. And this was, you know, where the women have really kind of rallied, because he got away for decades with abusing, raping, and other kinds of sexual abuse of young women, many of them underage, because he was protected. Because he was protected, the black community said, well, you know, if we dob him in, it's going to reflect badly on us. And so what intersectionality is, I'm talking about this context in the States now, which is, you know, different from here, I give you that, but that it's been a struggle to have women of colour's issues recognised and taken seriously, because there's been this kind of cone of silence, and that's changing, and that's very powerful. And so I think we have to, here in Australia, we have to find, you know, our own mechanisms, if you like, for identifying the issues and bringing them all together. And when we have an issue like, for example, violence against women, you know, women who are victims of violence aren't just white women, they aren't just people of colour, they aren't just disabled women, it's everybody. And we have to find a way that makes that very explicit, and that's, I think we're trying to do that.
I think we are too, but I think for me, when we talk about these days, when we talk about equality, it's usually about the men and women. And so I see, you know, we've just had International Women's Day where the theme was balance. And I gave a few talks where I talked about, you know, it being like this, people were describing it as these justice scales of men and women. And for me as a woman of colour, who, for me, the experiences that I've had in my life aren't just about being a woman, but also about being a woman of colour, a Muslim woman, a minority woman, and all of those other things, and a pretty bad cook. I've had experiences from that too. But yeah, there's a kind of a balance also that occurs within and among women, which is about I'm not going to celebrate until every sister can celebrate with me. I'm not going to pat myself on the back and say, well done, until every sister has the same opportunities that I have and that every other woman has. And I think that's kind of, for me, where in the Australian context, where we have Aboriginal women, for example, experience violence at 32 times the rate of non-Aboriginal women. And that's a particularly stark example. But these issues that we've spoken about today, about this kind of expectation to marry a doctor or a lawyer, these still exist, particularly among ethnic and migrant women in some communities. And I talk to young women every day, who say to me, I want to be this and I want to do this, but there's this expectation. There's this expectation. And I want to go back to the practical, because you were talking earlier about when you got involved in politics, and you can see this kind of pragmatic change that you were making. And where we're at now, in terms of an assessment of where we are, and there's, I think you'll agree that we've still got a long way to go. Would you say that we've gone a little bit backwards in many regards, or have we stagnated in terms of the things that you wanted to achieve? And do we really actually need that revolution?
Well, that's a big question. There's a lot to to try to respond to. I think, you know, the answer is yes and yes and no and maybe and possibly but what sort of the way I analyse it, and I talk about this in the book, I've got a chapter called The Getting of Anger. And in that chapter, I talk about what happened in the 1990s when John Howard came along and basically ripped up pretty much everything that we'd achieved in the Whitlam, Hawke and Keating governments, and which Fraser had basically left alone. I mean, Fraser didn't do a lot, but he didn't destroy it either. He kind of left things in place. Whereas Howard came along determined to rip it all up and to impose this white picket fence morality or the ideology on the whole population. And I was, you know, I was both heartbroken and in the end angry when he abolished things like the Women's Bureau. He abolished all of the mechanisms that we had set up that would measure what was happening, you know, women's employment, women's pay, women's participation in sport, women's this, everything. You know, we had a special unit in the Australian Bureau of Statistics that measured all this. We used to have a quarterly publication that reported on it. He got rid of all of that. He tried to get rid of the Office of the Status of Women. When he couldn't do that, he then put Pooh Gowd in charge of it, which is basically the same thing. He got rid of so many, his attitudes towards women, like he stopped lesbians from having access to IVF, for example. He ripped the guts out of the Human Rights Commission, took away the complaint handling powers, took away their budget, you know, basically gutted it so that, you know, it's window dressing and can do educating work, but it can't do the kind of forensic investigations and prosecutions that it was designed to do. And worst of all, I think he then changed the tax system, he changed employment policy, he changed all of the policies to make it punitive, if not impossible, for mothers to go into the workforce. The financial penalties that he created, and many which survive today, and which account for the very low participation rate of women in this country compared with the rest of the OECD. So, I mean, that we have definitely went backwards when he did all that. That was criminal. And I think, you know, we've picked up a bit since then. We've recovered a lot since then, but not everything. You know, for example, something like childcare. We spend $9 billion a year on childcare, and the system doesn't work. Nobody's happy with it. And the basic issues with childcare always have been availability and cost. And we've still got those two issues, even though we spent, where's the $9 billion going? So it's not the money, it's the system. Yeah, well, maybe that's where it's going. And in fact, they have gone back to privatising childcare the way they did under Howard, and look what happened there. So there's so many areas like that where all of the things that we had achieved and which had been, you know, designed to try and achieve a really good result for everybody, we got rid of, and then we entered into this kind of siege mentality that we're only just getting out of. I think the things that are positive that, you know, I talked about in my press club speech last Wednesday is the success of the affirmative action policies for the representation of women in the Labor Party is phenomenal. The success of Emily's list, so the majority of those women are pro-choice. That is so important. So it's really important to have women in decision-making positions of power and a diversity of women in those positions, because women in power will act for women. You know, where there's ample evidence of that all of the great social reforms of the past 30 years that benefit women have been either instigated by women or, you know, demanded by women. And you know, think of the Sex Discrimination Act, you think of the paid parental leave, you think of the NDIS, you know, the apology to mothers whose children were taken from them, all the stuff that Gillard did and Jenny Macklin did. So it really, really matters to have women in power, and we've waited a long time and we're almost at parity with the Labor Party. Should probably happen in May. Other side of politics have basically said to the women, we don't want you, piss off. And let's hope the electorate judges them accordingly. So that's good. You know, so there's good things and bad things.
And you know, you've got a pretty scathing assessment of the Howard years and I imagine the Abbott years, but your assessment of the current government is equally scathing. You have said misogyny is now the hallmark of the Liberal Party. It is a badge worn with pride. I'm not going to argue with that. I think that's pretty accurate. But I do want to then...
Would you just put what the Prime Minister said on International Women's Day?
Oh my goodness, no words. No words. I was fuming.
International Women's Day, wouldn't you think the Prime Minister would talk about women for start?
No. But this is where I want to go with this because... Maybe he took the woe out of women's and just thought it was Men's Day. But this is where I want to kind of finish up here, and then we'll go to the audience, is on this current kind of... When I heard the words that the Prime Minister said, you know, on social media, you hear a lot of men saying things, you know, through this toxic masculinity movement. And, oh, what about the men? And why do the women get it? Feminism is about dominating men and about women taking the place of men and women wanting to be like men. And so we've got this I get this kind of echo chambers out there at the moment that are really impacting on how young men see feminism, but also how young women see feminism. And just as a finish up to our conversation before we head to questions, Anne, yeah, I'd like to hear you say something about this. And you know, you did mention the Me Too movement. And I often think the Me Too movement is assessed not as a movement or critiqued as a movement, but critiqued and assessed as a hashtag, as opposed to an actual something substantive. So where are we, just to finish off, it's a big question, but where are we at the moment with this rising misogyny that's at the highest levels as much as it is at the lower levels?
I mean, it's a really, you know, interesting and kind of perplexing issue, I think. And we were talking about this we had this little lunch today with some terrific women put on by Emily's List, and we were talking about that there and saying, you know, when I was in my early feminist days, we never used the word misogyny. We used the word male chauvinism that sort of described things back then. Misogyny was kind of it was like too strong, or I don't know, but I mean, misogyny was a word that basically Julia Gillard brought it back into our vocabulary for good reason. And she did us a great favour, I think, because she made us sort of confront this word. Is that too? I remember when she first said it, and all these journalists used to, particularly women journalists, used to ring me up and say, well, you know, hasn't she gone over the top? Misogynist, that's too strong. Hatred.
She was talking about something like that, wasn't she?
Exactly. I mean, I think that the word wasn't actually strong enough, but when you think about, when you look at what happened to her and what's happened to so many other women in either powerful positions or, you know, in positions places where they're not wanted, and misogyny, I think, is kind of a spectrum of feelings from absolute hatred leading to murder, to hostility, just not wanting women there. And you see the not wanting women there, well, certainly in the Liberal Party, they don't want them, so they're out the door. Sterling by-election the other day, anyone? But in all sorts of situations, in work situations, women, you know, being resented for getting certain jobs or getting elevated to certain positions. And so the payback, if you like, is hostility, and that can be expressed via sexual harassment. It can be expressed in all kinds of ways. And it really is quite... I mean, I just heard a story today of just the things that are yelled... I mean, you must have your own stories. In federal parliament, do people yell out stuff at you?
Oh, all the time. They yell it, they write it. I don't listen to them.
What do they say?
Oh, so I don't care. I don't listen to them. They call the Labor women. One of them, Alex Hawke, who's some bland white bloke, said that all the Labor women were cookie cutter, and that's why they won't have quotas, because none of us got there on merit because we're all cookie cutter women. Well, this cookie cutter? I don't think so. But yeah, they do it all the time.
Well, I mean, this is just, I mean, at one level it's juvenile, but another level is how dare they? Now, you're sitting there as an equal member of parliament elected by your electorate, and you're sitting there doing your job, representing your people, trying to, you know, get the opposition and hopefully soon government. And these boys are sort of yelling out stuff like that. It's just pathetic.
It's more than that. It's the whole discussion around merit. That the underlying message is none of you got here on merit. All you women, you all got here because some bloke gave up a place for you, which I find, that's what I find particularly insulting, that you've got these really unextraordinary men so passionately... And they're so passionate about merit.
That's the point I made today in the press club. I mean, if they really actually did select by merit in the Liberal Party, there would be a lot more women there.
Oh yeah, none of those blokes would be there. None of those blokes would be there.
They don't just select men, they only select a very narrow band of men, and then I think the way the Liberal Party is going, it will soon be like, you know, 90% men, and half of them will be from the IPA and the other half will be from the military. That's all they care about.
Well, I've got to say, I've really enjoyed this discussion. I feel like...
I wanted to ask you some questions, I didn't even get to that.
Oh, we'll get there. Oh, it's Linda's turn, but I felt like, you know, we've been sitting down in our lounge room and just having a bit of a chat, and I really do appreciate that. But I think it's time to go to the audience. So I'm going to hand over to Linda, who will moderate, if you can hear me, the questions. Thank you, Anne. Let's give Anne a hand. Yes, please. Give it up for Anne. Fantastic.